It's 1987 and Games Workshop releases a game called Warhammer 40,000, subtitled Rogue Trader. And in this first edition, we get to see Orks and get introduced to the faction as a whole. In fact, they're known as Space Orks. When you look at the Space Orks, you notice something very interesting about them. In fact, some specific models are wearing something that we can distinctly say is Space Marine armor. For my miniatures, I want to create two very distinct looks. For the first one, I want to go for much more of a retro style and try to match the original look of the miniature, but with modern bits. And then for the second one, I want to go for something else entirely and just create a much more of a modern looking Space Ork in Space Marine armor, just to try to see which version will actually even look better. Who knows? Maybe new's better. For the more modern iteration of the two Space Orks, I decided to grab the Primaris Intercessor kit. Similar to some of the old models, I did consider using this choppa and essentially creating the idea that the Ork arm is sticking out of the Space Marine plate. But it just wasn't turning out the way I wanted to, so instead I grabbed an entirely different Primaris body and began removing some of the neck collar area to create a much more natural pose for where the Ork head is gonna go. With my favorite head selected, I got out some green stuff and started mixing it together. With my limited skill, I'll be going for very simple sculpts, but at the same time, this will be the main component. I started with a very basic version of just a little piece of green stuff and shoved it in where I thought the neck would be. To ensure that this guy would actually look like an orc, I made sure to give him the hunched over posture and create a much more thicker neck that you often see in orcs. The hunched over posture I think will be the most important thing of giving him a proper orky silhouette. And something I've just been really excited about is to try to make a loincloth. With the flattest piece of green stuff I could make, I tried sculpting it in a way that I thought it would be laying on the armor. But I instantly started running into the issue of the whole thing just clumping together and turning out absolutely dreadfully. With the dream of the perfect loincloth crumpled up in front of my eyes, I decided to leave it alone for some time and get working on the other steps. The Space Marine torso visually is quite obviously much thinner than an orc one. So with a bit of green stuff, I'm hoping to expand the shoulder area much more and create a much more natural looking orky silhouette. But when attaching it, I realized that putting on the shoulder pauldron too early was a little bit of a mistake, as this limited the way I was able to pose my arm, and inadvertently I also ended up grabbing my finger and smudging my already horrible looking loincloth. This was the moment I contemplated ripping it straight off, but I wanted to try one last thing. Something about the shape of the loincloth made me think that this might actually be savable if I make it look like it's flowing in the wind and it's naturally folding up. And to my surprise, it actually turned out kinda decent. So I moved on to the right arm, this time doing my absolute best to keep my massive fingers away from the loincloth and create a very simple smooth shape connecting the arm to the torso. For this orc, I did give him a power pack mainly because I wanted him to be the most Space Marine looking one of the two. As ridiculous as this idea was, I can't help but feel like it turned out pretty awesome. Since the second version is going to have a lot more of a classical look, I decided to use the Firstborn Space Marine armor and the old Ork Boy set, as it's the only one that's actually customizable of the two. And I instantly had the idea to use the actual proper orc torso instead of the Space Marine one. But when I used my massive head trimmers to remove the Space Marine chestplate, I didn't realize that the back of it flew off. So after spending 15 minutes searching all over my room as this thing got catapulted across the house, I eventually got it looking kinda decent and started working on the orc torso. Thankfully, as I scraped a portion of the inner leg, I was able to insert the torso almost inside the belt area. For the head, even though the left one did look a bit more ridiculous, I decided to go for the right one as it reminded me of one of the modern orc boys that I have in my collection. For the arms, using a combination of the old kit as well as the new arm from the Ork Commando set. When it came to posing the arms, I wanted to go for a much more retro look where the models are very stiff in their appearance. When attaching the shoulder pad, interestingly enough, the old version of the Ork arm was actually the perfect match for the Space Marine pad. It was quite nice that it went on without any modifications and it was very quick to do. Unfortunately, when it came to the Commander shoulder pad, I actually had to spend a very long time very slowly just scraping away the inside of the shoulder pad to make it fit a little bit better. But after that, it was a perfect mirror of the other shoulder pad. Even though similar to the modern Space Marine, I did consider giving him the power pack. But looking over the artwork, I realized that orcs do not wear power packs. So instead, I opted in to use one of these totems that orcs often carry into battle, which gave this guy even more of a retro look that I just thought looked pretty awesome. Additionally, it actually looked really cool in the little ring on the back of the harness. With the Space Orks finally equipped with their Space Marine armor, it was time to make sure that they actually look like proper Space Marines by painting them in their appropriate colors. As I'm sure we're all familiar with the fact that Ultramarines are the poster boys of Warhammer 40k, they're also the highlighted chapter in the upcoming Space Marine 2 game. So making sure the modern Primaris one was in blue was a no-brainer. This did get me kind of inspired to try the heavy metal look for a traditional looking Ultramarine. So with a classical approach, I applied a black wash all over the miniature and then used a wet brush to clean off the plates. With it looking quite decent, I decided to leave it right here and focus on the skin color. Most of my orcs usually have a very crazy looking radioactive skin color, but I decided to go for something a little bit more tame here. Which also felt quite appropriate given the fact that I'm trying to make these models look a little bit more like something you would see on an actual Games Workshop website. But of course, nowhere near to the absolute godly standard that the heavy painters paint in. However, after I finished my highlights of the skin, I tried correcting some of the mistakes that you often do in the standard Games Workshop process, and I ended up messing it up quite a bit to the point that the armor just looked incredibly horribly and patchy. Naturally, I could have repainted the entire model, but I personally saw this as my unconscious mind telling me that I just simply don't paint it that way, and I should paint the model the way I actually wanted to paint it in the first place. When it came to painting the loincloth, I originally wanted to go for something very bright and red to contrast against the blue. But I thought that going for something a little bit darker will actually do a much better job of masking my, well, let's be honest, quite horrible sculpting skills and the fact that it's not actually a loincloth. Instead, I went for a very bright and looking saturated leather color to hopefully draw the eye away from it and concentrate more on the actual model itself. Then finishing up with some additional small details and getting to the most important part of an Ultramarine, some gold looking armor. I think this gold paint looks particularly awesome, so I couldn't help myself but apply it to every single area I could possibly think of. Then using some gunmetal gray for his weapons. And just like that, the Ultrawaaaghrine was actually looking pretty cool. For the retro of the two orcs, I did want to try to match the original red paint job that I saw in the artworks. For this, I simply applied some very dark looking red paint and then used my brightest red color as a zenithal highlight. We then working through the layers of trying to create some much more classical edge highlighting using the exact same pure red that I used for the zenithal highlight. And for the skin color, going for the exact same thing as the previous one. I mixed up the exact same wash, however this time I did add a little bit more flow improver just to reduce some of the staining that I saw in the previous version on the Ultrawaaaghrine. The original red armor that I saw in the pictures was actually highlighted in a very interesting orange color. It took quite a bit of time to try to get a color that was at least relatively close, and I had to go back and work in very thin layers, but eventually I got pretty close. For the highlights, as I knew doing perfect edge highlights is simply beyond my skill, and it's something that I didn't see in the original paint job either, I decided to hybridize between something that I saw in the paint job and something that I would actually paint myself. Even though it was simple, it looked really cool. The one thing I did end up doing a little bit differently is when I highlighted his skin, I ended up using a little bit more of the ice yellow. With the armor looking a little bit brighter than the Ultrawaaaghrine, I had to go for something a bit brighter for the skin just to make sure that it matched the style of the armor, not to mention would not get obscured and simply overshadowed by the brightness of that red. For the most important detail of his face, I ended up painting his lips and teeth. It's something that's relatively simple, but I've been noticing more and more that it just gives such a strong effect and makes the models just look a lot more interesting. And with that, let's see the final result. Now, after I finished these awesome space orcs that looted some Space Marine armor, I just couldn't help myself, so I started working on the next one already. In fact, this one's gonna be a chaos variation. Now, I'm sure you noticed the miniatures aren't base, so let me know what do you think I should go for. And I'll try to match all three miniatures for the next video and have them all looking on the same planet, maybe as part of the same warband. So for now, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Consider giving the video a like. And until the next video is out, consider watching this one.